So if we take a look, we've got to remember that Claudius is addressing not just Hamlet, but he's also very aware that he's addressing the court. Now, Hamlet was willing to just spew and speak honestly, almost forgetting that they're in public, or maybe intentionally doing so to embarrass everybody else, put them on notice. Claudius can't do that. And so you notice that his dual nature here with his audiences requires him to do very specific things. What are some things that stood out to you in his rhetorical choices here? Maybe we start this way. If you had to describe the tone to each audience, how would you describe the tone of Claudius's speech as interpreted by the court? How would they hear the words that Claudius is saying to Hamlet?
Maybe like hurtful.
How would the audience of the court see his words as hurtful?
Oh, I mean, like towards Hamlet.
Hamlet, okay, then let's go there. How would Hamlet see his words as hurtful?
Because he's saying that it's unmanly to grieve.
Yeah, look at the way that he calls out his grief as unmanly. In the same way that he calls old Norway previously impotent, we're again going there and saying, here, tis unmanly grief. Now, because of the dual nature of this audience, does Hamlet get a good opportunity to counter him? He just has to stand there and take it. What other words help us to see that there's a hurtful nature to how Claudius is addressing Hamlet? Look a couple of lines down and you notice he talks about, to do this, shows an understanding simple and unschooled. And so he's calling him stupid. You don't understand things as much as you'd like to think that you do. And he also says it shows a will most incorrect to heaven. You go against the nature of heaven by grieving in the way that you do. It's just like slap, slap, slap. And then notice how he finishes this off. He says, for what we know must be, and of course what we know is stated earlier. Hey, guess what, buddy? Your dad lost his dad. And you know what? His dad lost his dad too. Everybody loses their dad. You're nothing special. And so he says, for what we know must be, and is as common as any the most vulgar thing to sense. Where have we heard this word common before? Well, if we go back just a few lines, Gertrude mentioned to Hamlet the common nature of death. Everyone dies, it's common. And Hamlet responded by saying, yeah, you're right, it is common. And we said he's clearly intending to attack her. And here we see Claudius throw it right back in his face. And we know he understands the dual nature of it, because when he's saying, yes, what we know, as we've stated previously, is that all dads die. It's common. So number one, it's universally true. But then notice that the next line includes that word vulgar. And so by including vulgar, he's also acknowledging Hamlet's pun. I know what you were doing. I understand how you were trying to insult your mother. And by that matter, insult me as well. So guess what, little boy? I'm going to school you here in front of everybody. And so he puts it out there in that way to be clear to him. I have the floor. I'm the king. I'm going to put you in your place. Your parents may have done this to you before. They use your own words against you. And as they say it, they get that little smirk on their face. And you just kind of bite your lip really hard. And you kind of shake your head like, oh, I wish I could just say something right now. Notice where he goes from there. He comes back to these ideas of what it is. He says, 'tis a fault to heaven, a fault against the dead, a fault to nature. And so he seems to bring up these ideas of not only is your grief unmanly, not only does it show that you're stupid and simple and you don't understand things, but he's basically telling him your grief and the way that you are grieving your father is actually an insult to your father. It's an insult to everything there is. Did you pay attention to what comes back around line 106? Did you see those pronouns? We pray you throw to earth this unprevailing woe and think of us as of a father. So who would be we and us? Because we and us can't just be Claudius. Could it be Claudius and Gertrude? Yes. Who else could it be? Audience number 2. All of us that are here. Think of us as of a father. And he says, for let the world take note. He's now going, hey, all of us, now we're the world. He says, you are the most immediate to our throne. Well, do the people know that? Yeah, that's why Claudius had to give the speech that he gave that opened this scene to legitimize why he's the king. Here he's looking at Hamlet and he's going, hey, buddy, I know you're next. And look at where he goes with this. What does Hamlet want to do? He wants to go back to school. And what does he say? Nah, you're going to remain here. You're not going back to school. Why do you think Claudius doesn't want him to go back to school? Do you think it's as he says here because of your grief, because we don't think it's a good idea, because you're still upset? Or do you think instead it has everything to do with this guy right here? Think about what's happening over here in Norway. A son of a dead king whose uncle sits on the throne is not happy and has assembled a secret army that his uncle knows nothing about and is looking to attack. So if we send Hamlet away to school, can we understand that Claudius is looking at this going, hey, you are the most immediate to our throne. We want to keep our eye on you. And so guess what? You don't get to leave. You don't get to go anywhere. Are you seeing how this speech works in terms of how he's addressing Hamlet? But now look at audience number 2. How is audience number 2 going to read the tone of this speech? So think in your own sense. Imagine you're watching this separately. You're in Walmart. Well, not anymore. Imagine that you're somewhere and you're watching an argument between a parent and a child. Maybe you're over at your friend's house. Maybe. You're watching a teenager argue with his parents, and the teenager is being really disrespectful. And then dad speaks up and is just like, hey, buddy, we don't think that this is a good idea. We want you to stay here with us. And look at how he ends this speech. Look at those last couple of lines. Now, as the observer, you know that old Hamlet is dead. But when you look around, you notice, hey, the majority of people are not mourning anymore. We must be good. You read the room and you read the temperature. If most people are still mourning, then you're going to be quiet and respectful. But if most people aren't, you're going to be okay. It's time to move on. And you see one person that wants to be upset and mad, are you going to see them as the issue, or are you going to see everyone else that has moved on as the issue? You're likely to see Hamlet as a petulant little jerk. And here, you're going to see a very different thing, and Claudius hits it perfectly. Did you notice that everybody cheers when he says, you're the most immediate to our throne? And everybody went, yay! Because they think that this is a speech that is comforting Hamlet. Claudius is going like, hey, buddy, I know you're hurting. Like, you gotta suck it up. And we care about you. We want you to be our son. Come give us a hug. Everybody eats this speech up. And so here's Claudius, who's looking at Hamlet from the throne, and Hamlet's just glowering back at him like, oh my God, I hate you, Uncle Dad. And Claudius is just like, yeah, I know you do. But everybody loves me because I made it work with this rhetoric. This speech is a great example of hitting two different audiences in two different ways. And it shows us that Claudius is not a character who is singular dimensioned. He has multiple sides. He is smart. He is intelligent. He knows what's going on. And he is automatically in conflict with Hamlet. We're going to wrap this up really quickly. They're going to disappear, and what we are going to be left with, and we're going to run right into this, begins at the bottom here of the page 30 and runs over to the end of 31. So once we hit the end of 31, don't flip the page. This is Hamlet's first soliloquy. Are you familiar with what a soliloquy is? So let's write it so that you see the word, because it's a weird one. So a soliloquy is a speech given by a character when they're alone on stage that allows them time to process their inner thoughts. In fiction, this is where we get that italicized text where we hear what a character's thinking inside, and we're like, ooh, this is really deep. This lets them work through their problems on their own. This is kind of like what you do. The equivalent for you may be when you're driving in your car and you're kind of talking out loud about what's bothering you and hoping that you can come to a conclusion. That's a good way to see a soliloquy. Hamlet has a number of soliloquies in this play. And most people will tell you that for an actor who is playing Hamlet, it doesn't matter if you flub any of the other lines in the play. You have to nail Hamlet's soliloquies to be able to understand it. I've even spoken to teachers who say they don't teach Hamlet end to end. All they teach are the soliloquies. And I'm like, wow, you're an idiot. Like, you missed so much. Why? What are you doing? When we get to that soliloquy, we're going to stop for a second once we listen to be able to give you a chance to process. Think of it as a poem, if you will. These soliloquies have a definite focus. They capture that character in a moment and allow them to express themselves in this really big way to see what they're dealing with and what they're going through. And we can delve into really understand Hamlet's situation at that moment. And so we'll listen to the end of this, we'll get rid of them, and we'll hear Hamlet's soliloquy, and then we'll talk about it.
Let not thy mother lose her prayers, Hamlet. I pray thee, stay with us. Go not to Wittenberg.
I shall in all my best obey you, madam.
Why, it is a loving and a fair reply. Be as ourselves in Denmark. Madam, come. This gentle and unforced accord of Hamlet sits smiling to my heart, in grace whereof no jocund health that Denmark thinks today, but the great cannon to the clouds shall tell. And the king's rouse, the heavens shall brew it again, re-speaking earthly thunder.
Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Oh, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie! 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. That it should come to this. But 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to a satyr. So loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must I remember, where she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet within a month, let me not think on't. Frailty, thy name is woman, a little month, or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe, all tears. Why she, even she, oh God, a beast that once discourse of reason would have mourned longer, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules, within a month. Yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her gauntlet eyes. She married. Oh, most wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot come to good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue.
All right, take a couple minutes, look over that soliloquy, use your notes to kind of help you too, see what you can pick out, and then we'll talk about what's going on here and what we can talk about and discuss. All right, so as we start, let's turn our attention to 30 and kind of wrap up what happens after Claudius's speech. You notice that Hamlet's response to it is focused on his mother, not at all to him. You know, she says, "Please listen to us," and he says, "I'll do my best to obey you, madam." The pronoun is definite. He refers to her. He's almost ignoring everything that was said. He is angry. He is seething. But even though he is, we're going to see how that comes out in his soliloquy. One thing to note at the end here, as Claudius leaves, they mention cannons. And, you know, no jocund, he says, "In a grace whereof no jocund health that Denmark drinks today, but the great cannon to the clouds shall tell. And the kings rouse the heavens shall bruit again, re-speaking earthly thunder." He's basically saying, hey, let's all go get a drink. Because at the time in Denmark, when they would give a toast, they would fire off cannons. Now, this is only important because later in Act 1, they're going to comment on the fact that they're hearing cannon fire off in the distance, and they're going to say, oh, they're just drinking again. There they go. You notice that it seems to be a party atmosphere, and then we leave poor Hamlet here to mope. Let's talk about this soliloquy. What stands out to you about it? What do you take note of? Okay, so let's start to move through here together. And let's start with this. If you had to, looking at this soliloquy, define what is Hamlet's conflict at this moment, what is it?
Maybe he feels like his mom betrayed his dad.
I would agree. Notice that Claudius is not absent from this. We're going to talk about the references to him, but he is not the focus. Even though Claudius kind of did a little browbeating on it in that earlier speech, that's not where Hamlet's central mind is like, oh, what a jerk. Uncle Dad, I can't believe it. He's upset at his mom. If we look at how he presents it, let's start to kind of dig this apart. How does he present his father?
Hyperion.
Yeah. Who's Hyperion?
Isn't that sun god?
Uh-huh. He's this sun god. And he compares his father as Hyperion to who?
A scythe.
Yeah, who is that that's the satyr?
A goat-like. Last one is like the creature.
That's what a satyr is. But he's comparing Claudius to the satyr because he's basically saying, how could my mother prefer him to my father? It's like Hyperion to a satyr. Okay, so let's take this. Hyperion, we said sun god, great. Satyr, we can read the definition. We could be like, oh, it's this mythological little goat creature. Okay, you know satyrs. Go back in your mind to thinking about Narnia. Whether you read the books or you saw the movie. Remember Mr. Tumnus? Half man, half goat? Satyr. Or if you ever saw Hercules as a kid and you think of Phil. Phil's a satyr. Now, one thing that's not in the book and one thing that you don't know from your depictions is that satyrs are horny little goat creatures. Literally in mythology, they like run around and screw women. That's what they're doing. They're driven by sex. And so notice here that in this depiction, he's clear that his father's a god, while Claudius is this like little beast man. But he also seems to say something about the nature of the relationship. He also compares his father later to what? He kind of compares this difference. He compares his father to his brother as Hamlet would be compared to whom?
Hercules.
Hercules. So notice that in both depictions of Hamlet's father, we elevate him to this godlike level. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that Hamlet's dad was really that great? I think it's fair to say no. Because I think what we need to be aware of is the fact that to any child who has lost a parent that they loved, we glorify. We hold them up as higher and better than. And often better than they actually were. We stop seeing them sometimes as people and we see them as these figures. And Hamlet is doing that. He's elevating his father, but recognizing that elevation is really important. Let's talk about what he expects from his mother. Based on this, what does he expect his mother to do? Mourn. What figure does he use to help to kind of hit that? Again, you notice he returns to a reference, an allusion, to be able to build that. He compares his mother to who? Yeah, he mentions Niobe, all tears. And there's that note on the side that kind of gives you a little bit on Niobe, the woman who wept ceaselessly when her children were slain by Apollo. He wants that. He wants his mother to show emotion. And instead, he sees her as doing what? Instead of mourning and instead of doing this, by the time we get to the end, he says, "Oh, most wicked speed to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets." He sees his mother as so quickly jumping into bed with Claudius rather than correctly mourning his father. And so we notice all of these things coming out. Did you notice how he talks about time as the soliloquy goes on? when he starts the soliloquy, how long has his father been dead?
2 months.
2 months. And then really quickly he says what?
Maybe less.
Maybe less. Maybe that. Not 2 months. Less than 2 months. And then you notice that the time keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Do we tend to do this kind of hyperbolizing as well about how quickly things might have moved on? You know, all of a sudden what was legitimately like 5 minutes that you had to wait, you're like, oh my God, I had to wait hours for this person to help me. Ugh. And you're like, no, you didn't. You just got impatient. And you notice in the same way, Hamlet wants to limit that time. As he gets more angry, that time becomes less and less and less. Before we move on, I want to leave you with one last thing that he introduces here that we need to kind of understand and contextualize to be able to understand where he's going. As he begins this soliloquy, he explains his view of Denmark. And he says that Denmark is an unweeded garden, meaning that amongst all the pretty flowers and the good things, we have the disastrous and dirty weeds that are present there. There is something rank and gross in that ideal, as he says, to possess it with these weeds and this stuff that has grown up. Now, he's talking about things like his uncle's influence and the way that his mother has moved on. But we also have to remember that in scene 1, we're presented with a freaking ghost that is haunting. We're going to notice that as the play goes on, this idea of Denmark as this unweeded garden with these bad things that are present are going to constantly come up, whether they are supernatural, whether they are more natural, whether they are cunning and conniving, as these characters will be. We are going to see these images of things not being right. And of course, by the end of Act 1, we're going to have the famous phrase, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And it kind of follows up with that. Shakespeare wants us to see things aren't right. And he's going to position Hamlet as the only person that really can make things right. As we continue from this soliloquy, we're going to present finally Horatio and Marcellus. And I think just those two, maybe. And Bernardo, even though Bernardo doesn't speak. They're going to come back and they're going to do what they have said they would do from scene 1. And so we're going to establish here, we're going to let this sort of run out a little bit. And it's fine because it's pretty much a summary of what we have done. Some things that I would point out to you. You're going to notice that 1, Hamlet's, we'll look at that quick before we let it run out. Let's see how they introduce and change this. Remember that this soliloquy is all in Hamlet's head. Think about when you get lost in thoughts and someone interrupts you, it may take a second for you to kind of come back to the real world and register things. You're going to see that with Hamlet too.
I'm glad to see you well.
Or I do forget myself!
Same, my lord. And your poor servant Emma. Sir, my good friend, I'll change that name with you. And what made you from Wittenberg, Horatio? Marcellus.
My good lord.
I'm very glad to see you. Bernardo.
My lord.
Why did fate make you from Wittenberg?
A truant disposition, my lord.
I would not have your enemies say so, nor shall you do my ear that violence to make a truster of your own report against yourself. I know you are no truant. But what is your affair in Elsinore? We'll teach you to drink deep ere you depart.
My lord, I came to see your father's funeral.
I prithee do not mock me, fellow student. I think it was to see my mother's wedding.
Indeed, my lord. It followed hard upon.
Thrift, Horatio. The funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables. Would I have met my dearest foe in heaven or ever I had seen that day, Horatio? My father. Methinks I see my father.
Oh, where, my lord?
In my mind's eye, Horatio.
I saw him once. He was a goodly king.
He was a man. Take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again.
Okay, so before we shift it, let's talk a little bit about this introduction of Horatio. So you notice at the beginning of the scene, or the beginning of this coming back after the soliloquy, it takes Hamlet a second to register who he's seeing and what's going on. And remember, it takes him that second because Horatio is supposed to be at school in Wittenberg in Germany. And so Denmark is not anywhere close to Germany. And so it's just like, dude, what are you doing here? We see their friendship established because you notice the jokes. If you look towards the bottom of the page, you notice that bit about, I came for your father's funeral, and he's like, nah, you came for my mom's wedding. And he's like, yeah, those happened really quick together. And he's like, yeah, they did, because they're being cheap, buddy. Thrift. They can use the leftovers from the funeral to cater the wedding. He's making jokes. We establish that good nature between the two of them. And then I always like to point this out. Notice that when they start to talk about Hamlet's father, Horatio is really kind of good about it. He says, yeah, I met your father once. He was a really good man. And look at what Hamlet says. He goes, he was just a man. Like, don't make any more of him than that. And you're going, dude, you just described your dad as a god. And now you're like, oh, don't. He's just a guy. Like, don't. Do we do this, though? We like to show that humbleness, but inside we think that somebody's really great. Wow, they're not that. We play it down. Inside we got it. It lets us see that dual nature of Hamlet as a person. Now, as we roll through the rest of this, they're going to basically summate what they saw. It's going to take Hamlet a little bit of time because, again, if somebody came to you and said, hey, Callista, I saw a ghost last night, and it was the ghost of your great-grandma. Like, I know it was. Trust me, I saw a picture of her once. It was your great-grandma. And you're going to be like, whatever, dude. And it's like, no, really, like, she looked like this, and she was wearing this, and she had that. And it's going to take a little bit, but they're just going to summate. It's going to be the same thing again.
My lord, I think I saw him yesterday. So? Who? My lord the king, your father.
King, my father.
Season your admiration for a while, with an attent ear till I may deliver, upon the witness of these gentlemen, this marvel to you.
Oh, for God's love, let me hear.
2 nights together had these gentlemen, Marcellus and Bernardo, on their watch, in the dead waste and middle of the night, been thus encountered. A figure like your father, armed at all points exactly, cap a pay, appears before them, and with solemn march goes slow and stately by them. Thrice he walked by their oppressed and fear surprised eyes, within his truncheon's length, whilst they, distilled almost to jelly with the act of fear, stand dumb and speak not to him. This to me in dreadful secrecy imparts